Well, uh, today we'll do a real joyous topic for our meditation. It just comes from the line from the Quran, uh, and there's similar versions of this throughout all contemplative traditions. But the line from Quran is, "Die before you die," and that's a kind of wisdom, and it is joyous when you understand it. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this on Saturday in some depth, but we'll sort of open up the issue today. Die before you die. Well, why could that be joyous? Well, uh, I used to uh, teach the Gospel of Mark as a junior grade book in junior high. I loved Mark, and it was short, and you could teach it sort of like a novella, a little short story, a long short story. So I taught it for several years, and I always got in trouble for teaching it, by the way. That was one of the ironies of spending my life teaching in Catholic schools. You teach the gospel, and you'll get in trouble every time. That should lead us to understand that we're really not getting the gospel. And I want to read you just, there's a very interesting thing in the Gospel of Mark, which is what I taught for many years. 3 chapters in succession, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10. Jesus tells them, "Hey, I'm going to die." And he's talking about, really in his own language, dying before you die, because he was, the joyous news was, yeah, but then I'm coming back. But in each case, and I'm going to read you just the first one. The first one is really choice, because in most cases, either they don't get it, the apostles don't get it, or they try to change the subject. The first one's a famous, let's change the subject here. Let's not be talking about all this, this morbid crap. All right, so this is from chapter 8, and it's my favorite one. Jesus and his disciples headed out for the villages around Caesarea Philippi. As they walked, he asked, "Who do people say I am?" Some say John the Baptizer, they said. Others say Elijah. Still others say one of the prophets. He asked them, "Well, who do you say? What are you saying about me? Who am I?" Peter gave the answer, "You are the Christ, the Messiah." Jesus warned them to keep it quiet, not to breathe a word of it to anyone. He then began explaining things to them. Now, here comes the punchline. It is necessary for the Son of Man to proceed to an ordeal of suffering. He'll be tried and found guilty by the elders, high priests, and religious scholars, and he will be killed. And after 3 days, rise alive. He said this simply and clearly so they couldn't miss it. Peter grabbed him in protest. Turning and seeing his disciples wavering, wondering what to believe, Jesus confronted Peter. "Peter, get out of my way. Satan, get lost. You have no idea of how God works." Calling the crowd to join his disciples, he said, "Anyone who intends to come with me has to let me lead. You're not in the driver's seat. I am. Don't run from suffering. Embrace it. Don't run from suffering. Embrace it. Follow me, and I'll show you how to do this." Self-help is no help at all. Self-sacrifice is the way, my way, to saving yourself, your true self. What good would it do to get everything you want and lose you, the real you? What could ever trade your soul for? What could you ever trade your soul for? Yeah. So he's giving him the news, and he says, this is very interesting. He said, anyone who intends to come with me has to let me lead. You're not in the driver's seat. I am. Don't run from suffering. Embrace it. Well, this was not a message that not only that they wanted to hear. Peter, the leader, just said, "Well, no, let's really, that's not the subject we want to hear." And Jesus sort of, and then he said, if you want, follow me. He never said believe anything. He just said, you obviously can't hear the message, so watch. And he showed them what it meant. He showed them what it meant. Okay, so this is sort of the essence of it. And he says it 2 more times in the next chapter. And in each case, after the third one, it's ludicrous. They're going into Jerusalem where all this is going to happen. And after he tells them the third time, look, we're not going to really take over. They're going to arrest me, torture me, kill me, and but then I'm going to come back. So don't worry about it. And they don't get it. They start arguing about, well, who's going to be at your right hand when they take power? They just don't get die before you die. They don't get the essence of what Jesus is saying. And I'd say, 2,000 years later, not many other people do too. People, so-called Christians. Richard Rohr likes to say the only spiritual denomination that is more popular, it has more members in the United States than the Roman Catholics, are the ex-Roman Catholics. The people have left in abundance because essentially they haven't got the message, die before you die. This is the essence of, it's in the Quran, it's in Hinduism. This is one of my favorite bits from Hinduism. It's a kind of aphorism or wisdom truth. It says the surprise of surprises is that although everybody who has ever lived in this world has died, for some reason, we think we won't. Yeah. It's the most basic fact. Everybody who's ever lived dies. But for some reason, this is a big surprise. We think we won't. And then here's a little quote from a doctor. He said, death is not primarily a medical event. Death is a personal and spiritual event. Yet we are largely concerned with preparing for the medical. Yeah, that's our culture. And if you're in the medical field, death is a failure. So we're in this weird culture. You got to understand that. What we're doing is countercultural. To want to live a contemplative life in an ancient tradition that knew what was what. You're going to be out of sync with this culture, but that's good because this culture is crazy. In case you haven't noticed, The other day, I heard a CEO from a corporation being asked because they've got this climate conference going in Glasgow, and the streets are filled with mostly young people just screaming about the fact that we're doing nothing as the planet burns up. And somebody said, well, don't you ever think about what the world's going to be like for your grandchildren and for their grandchildren? And the guy answered, no, I never think about it. And then the guy said, well, what do you think about? And he was honest. He said, because this is the training this is an insanity of our culture. He said, well, I think about the next quarter and the dividends. So, you got your choice of cultures here, wisdom culture, contemplative culture, where I'll talk a little bit more about it next Saturday, a culture where the young people, the teenagers in the street, have an adult perspective, and the guys running corporations and governments are acting like adolescents. We're living in this kind of like topsy-turvy world. So to try to understand what it really means to die before you die, I think we got to do it. That's really why you're here. And for those of us who grew up in Christianity, most of us grew up with some training in that. This is the heart of it, is it not? It's called the Paschal Mystery. Jesus suffers and dies, and then after 3 days, comes back. And he's bigger, he's better. That is the essential mystery that if you're Catholic and you've gone to the Mass or you still go to the Mass, that's exactly what's celebrated right in the center of what we call the Eucharist, which means Thanksgiving. We're thankful for this message, for this good news that, yeah, we're all going to die, but if you die before you die, especially, you can start celebrating early. This is what I call postgraduate studies. If you're a contemplative and you have a contemplative practice, you're basically celebrating this mystery, this Eucharist, this Thanksgiving early, because they can't kill what you are at the center. This is a beautiful teaching. That's why it's called good news. That's why it's called good news, because you don't have to take Jesus's word for it. You can try it out. That's basically what the Buddha said. The Buddha said it in a different way with different language, but at the end, when the Buddha was dying, he'd eaten some bad pork probably. It had been 40 years teaching them, and just like Jesus spent probably a year and a half of being frustrated of giving the teaching, die before you die, and they don't want to get it. No, the denial of this, the denial of death among human beings in our culture, it's amazing, so powerful. We'll do anything but think about these things and actually conceive of them. Yeah, one day I'm going to die. Watch Braveheart. William Wallace, at least the Mel Gibson version of him, says at the end, he said, "Every man dies, but not every man truly lives." So actually working with this kind of material, a statement, a wisdom statement like "die before you die," can lead you to really living. If it didn't, what's the point? Okay, it's not morbid at all. It's leading to a greater life. And so if you have a contemplative practice, you don't have to wait until Hafez puts it this way. This is the basis of so much of my work. This one poem by Hafez, he says, "You've been invited to meet the friend. No one can resist the divine invitation. That narrows down your choices to just two. You can come to God dressed for dancing, or be carried on a stretcher to God's ward." Either way. Now, the fact that most of us, I'd say most human beings, probably it's the second. But to come dressed for dancing means to engage in a serious, authentic, contemplative practice, which we're going to do. This is part of it. This is an authentic contemplative practice to have a communication, whether you're reading a text that has some heft to it, something that's talking about something really real stuff, rather than reading to distract yourself from the fact that the clock is ticking. But you're reading something real, spiritual literature. That's a contemplative practice. Listening to a talk like this is a contemplative practice. Giving a talk like this is a contemplative practice. So there's that. But then we move to the heart of this heart-to-heart meeting. These images resound for me, because this is a heart-to-heart is what we're doing here. One heart meets another, but the center of that is it's just like the Paschal Mystery. So how do you die before you die? Well, when the bell rings for 20 minutes, you die to everything that the ego's interested in. You just let it go. You just drop into someplace deeper. I call it dropping into the cave of the heart. If that image, some people like the image of just dropping into a hammock. There's something important about just for 20 minutes saying, all right, that other stuff, I'm dead to that for 20 minutes. Yeah, great, interesting thoughts will come up. it's no problem. Let them come up and go by. But when you grab onto them and you get all, you're back on the surface of things, you see. So we're dropping to a deeper place. It's why they call centering prayer. Centering prayer is because you're dropping to a center that's deeper than the surface of life. Nothing wrong with the surface of life. Nothing wrong with thinking hard about some things and solving problems. We got to do that. But we need to also take some time to die before we die. In other words, to sort of empty our cup of all our self-concern. I mean, when the cup is full of yourself, there's no room for the transcendent. And so this emptiness becomes part of the process. Okay, now you can, life is perfect. The design is perfect. We will have everything stripped away, to where none of it will make any difference, because life will do that if you're carried on a stretcher to God's ward. I finished a book this week that was exactly that. He was a neuroscientist who was literally carried in on a gurney because he had a spinal meningitis. He's a guy who spent time his whole life studying the brain and then helping save other people who had brain embolisms and things. Well, he had this wild kind of spinal meningitis, and so he literally was wheeled into the to the hospital on a gurney, and he literally died for 7 days. His brain died. He went on a 7-day journey into what's next. And for some reason, same reason that the Tibetans call people who did that in Tibet, which they studied for 700 years, they were sent back just to give us the clues here, just to say, hey, relax. It's okay. There's a further plan here. This is not a tragedy. It's something everybody has to go through, but there's more to come. So these people who came back after a day or two in Tibet, or even 3, they would interview them and see what it was like, and that there was not nothing. Okay, if you think they're just nothing, and so you're banking on that, just sort of like, oh, well, I can do whatever I want, the hell of it, because when you pull the plug, the lights are out and the show's over. Doesn't appear to be the truth, based on a lot of data. Well, this guy was a neuroscientist, and he went for 7 days unhooked from the brain. Some of you might know the stroke of insight, where another neuroscientist is very interesting. Somebody else who thinks it's all about the brain lost her left side of her brain, and Jill Bolte Taylor. Eben Alexander is the guy who I'm talking about, who was a neuroscientist, who actually was 7-day journey into what the Tibetans call the Bardo in between. And he came back and he writes about it. I'm going to highlight that in tomorrow's post. But we're going to do it right now. This is the invitation to come to God dressed for dancing. In other words, come to the transcendent realm by your own choice. So you get another view of what we're doing here when we hit the bell and we shut our eyes and we go into the darkness, that we're actually dying to everything superficial, and we're just being present, open, and available to anything from the transcendent. Look at it like that. It's practice. It's practice for that. So you can actually die before you die. That's another way to look at what we're doing. Okay, so let's move to our meditative mode. Give a chance to end the recording here.